Montana Territory, 1870. The sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silverpine as Thomas Griffin adjusted his hat against the late afternoon glare. At 25, he had already spent more years in the saddle than most men twice his age, the hard labor of ranch work etched into the lean muscles of his frame. His face remained youthful despite the elements, clean-shaven save for a slight stubble that had accumulated during his 3-day ride into town. Thomas believed one truth above all others: a cowboy's life was meant to be lived alone. The endless miles between homesteads, the unpredictable nature of the frontier, the constant movement with the herds, all of it made a poor foundation for anything resembling love. His parents' bitter marriage had taught him that lesson early, before consumption took his mother and whiskey claimed his father. "Keep to yourself and your cattle, boy," his father had told him once in a rare moment of sobriety. "Women bring nothing but complications." Thomas had intended to follow that advice indefinitely. He had come to Silverpine merely to purchase supplies for the upcoming cattle drive and perhaps enjoy a hot meal that wasn't cooked over a campfire. Nothing more than he saw her. Nora Mitchell stood behind the counter of her father's general store, sunlight streaming through the windows, turning her blonde hair into spun gold. At 22, she moved with a grace that seemed incongruous with the rough-hewn floorboards beneath her practical brown boots. Her blue calico dress had been mended in several places, but was spotlessly clean, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows as she measured coffee beans for another customer. "Can I help you find something, sir?" she asked, looking up when the bell above the door announced his entrance. Thomas removed his hat, suddenly conscious of the trail dust coating his clothes. "Just stocking up for the drive north," he managed, his practiced solitude making simple conversation feel foreign. "You must be with the Rocking G outfit," she said, offering a smile that reached her deep brown eyes. "Father said Mr. Grayson hired on extra hands for the Montana drive." Thomas nodded, surprised she had placed him so quickly. "Started last month. Your father seems to know everybody's business." "That's the privilege of running the only general store for 30 miles, she laughed, the sound as clear as a mountain stream. "I'm Nora Mitchell." "Thomas Griffin," he replied, extending a calloused hand that she accepted without hesitation. Her fingers were work-hardened too, he noticed, not the soft hands of an idle town girl, but those of someone who understood labor. Something about that simple fact burrowed beneath his carefully constructed defenses. "Mr. Grayson's outfit always needs good coffee for the trail," she said, already moving to gather his likely purchases. "And I suspect you'll be wanting tobacco, salt pork, and beans." As she assembled his order, Thomas found himself lingering, asking questions that had nothing to do with supplies. By the time he left the store an hour later, he had learned that Nora had run the store alongside her father since her mother's death 3 years prior, that she could read and write better than most men in the territory, and that her laugh made something long dormant within him stir to life. It meant nothing, he told himself as he rode back to the Rocking G ranch that evening. In 2 weeks, the cattle drive would begin, and he would be gone, heading north for months. Whatever momentary connection he'd felt would fade like morning mist under the summer sun. But the next day, he found himself back in town with a flimsy excuse about forgotten supplies, and the day after that. Each time, Nora greeted him with the same warm smile that seemed to see through the walls he had built around himself. On his 4th visit in as many days, Thomas was gathering courage to ask Nora to accompany him to the town's upcoming spring social when the store's door swung open with a violent crash. 3 men entered, trail-worn and heavily armed. The leader, a tall figure with a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw, surveyed the store with cold eyes that widened slightly at the sight of Nora. "Well now," he drawled, "I heard Mitchell had a pretty daughter, but no one mentioned she was a vision." Thomas instinctively stepped forward, placing himself between Nora and the newcomers. "Store's closing soon," he said evenly. "Best make your purchases quick." The scarred man's hand drifted to his holster. "I don't recall asking your opinion, Cowboy." "Gentlemen," Nora's father emerged from the back room, his face paling at the sight of the 3 men. "What can we help you with today?" The tension in the room thickened as the scarred man slowly shifted his gaze from Thomas to Mr. Mitchell. "Just passing through, old man, need supplies for the trail. And maybe some pleasant company." His eyes slid back to Nora. We have supplies in abundance, Mr. Mitchell said carefully. Nora, perhaps you could go prepare dinner while I help these gentlemen. Before Nora could move, the scarred man spoke again. Actually, I insist on the daughter's assistance. We have specific needs. Thomas recognized the predatory look in the man's eyes. Without thinking, he placed his hand on his own revolver. The lady's not available, he said quietly. For a long moment, the scarred man held Thomas's gaze, calculation visible behind his cold eyes. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Got yourself a watchdog, have you, Miss Mitchell? No matter. We've got time. He turned to his companions. Let's get what we came for, boys, for now. As they gathered supplies, paying with gold coins that Mr. Mitchell examined with suspicion, Thomas remained close to Nora. When the men finally left, he released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Who were they? He asked Mr. Mitchell. The older man wiped sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. That was Jackson Reeves. Him and his gang have been terrorizing settlements across 3 territories. Robbery, murder, there's not much evil they haven't done. I've heard that name, Thomas said. Thought he operated further west. He goes where the law is thinnest, mister. Mitchell replied, locking the store's door with uncharacteristic haste. And he always comes back for what catches his eye. His worried glance toward Nora made the implication clear. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The morning would bring his departure with the cattle drive, months on the trail driving 3,000 head north to Montana. He had signed a contract. Men were counting on him. Leaving meant security, wages, the continued building of his reputation as a reliable hand, but leaving also meant Nora would face whatever came next alone. Dawn found him riding into town, decision made. He found Mr. Grayson at the saloon, already drinking despite the early hour. I can't make the drive, Thomas said without preamble. Grayson's bushy eyebrows rose over bloodshot eyes. You signed papers, Griffin. I know. I'll forfeit my advance. The money represented most of Thomas's savings, but he pushed onward. There's trouble coming to Silver Pine. The Mitchell family might need protection. Grayson studied him for a long moment. This about the Mitchell girl. Pretty thing, I'll grant you, but worth throwing away good work. It's about doing what's right, Thomas replied, though even as he spoke, he knew it was more than that. Your choice, Grayson finally said. But don't come looking for work with me again if this goes south. Thomas nodded, accepting the consequence. By mid-morning, the cattle drive departed without him, dust rising from thousands of hooves as they began their long journey north. That afternoon, he approached the Mitchell store with an offer. He would work as security until the threat of Reeves had passed. Mr. Mitchell, practical despite his fear, insisted on putting Thomas on the payroll. If you're staying because of Nora, I should warn you, the older man said after they had struck their agreement. She's not like other girls, got ideas about independence, wants to open a school someday. Thomas smiled. I'm not trying to change her, sir. The older man gave him an appraising look. Maybe that's why she smiles differently when you're around. For 2 weeks, life settled into a new pattern. Thomas helped in the store, slept in the small room above the stable across the street, and accompanied Nora and her father whenever they needed to travel beyond the town's limits. In those quiet moments, riding alongside Nora to deliver medicines to outlying farms, helping her inventory shipments by lamplight, Thomas felt his long-held belief in solitude beginning to crack. Why did you really stay? Nora asked him one evening as they sat on the store's porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. You could be halfway to Montana by now. Thomas considered deflecting with talk of fair wages or professional obligation, but something in Nora's direct gaze made pretense impossible. I couldn't leave knowing you might be in danger, he admitted, and if I said I could take care of myself, there was no challenge in her tone, only genuine curiosity. Thomas smiled. I'd say you probably could. But no one should have to face men like Reeves alone. She was quiet for a moment, then placed her hand over his. Thank you for staying, Thomas. The simple touch sent warmth cascading through him, crumbling another stone in the wall around his heart. Their peaceful routine was shattered 3 days later when a rider galloped into town, his horse lathered with exertion. Thomas was stacking crates behind the store when he heard the commotion. Reeves hit the Donovan place, the rider was shouting to the gathering crowd. Burned it to the ground, they're headed this way. Thomas found Nora and her father inside, already preparing to barricade the store. "We should leave town," Thomas urged. "Head for Fort Laramie until the marshal can gather men." Mr. Mitchell shook his head. "This store is everything we have. I won't abandon it." "Father," Nora said gently, "we can rebuild. We cannot replace lives." The older man hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "We'll leave at nightfall, less chance of being spotted on the road." As darkness descended, Thomas helped them load a wagon with essentials. The town had fallen eerily quiet, most residents either fleeing or barricading themselves in their homes. They were securing the last of their belongings when hoofbeats echoed down the street. Thomas drew his revolver, pushing Nora behind him as 4 riders approached through the gloom. "Going somewhere," Jackson Reeves's voice carried easily in the night air. "That's not very hospitable." "We've got nothing you want, Reeves," Thomas called back, though he knew it was a lie. "I disagree." Reeves dismounted, his men following suit. "I've taken a particular interest in Miss Mitchell, been thinking she'd make a fine addition to my travels." Thomas felt Nora stiffen behind him. "That's not happening." Reeves laughed. "You're outnumbered, Cowboy, and from what I hear, the law won't be anywhere near for days. So here's my offer. Miss Mitchell comes with us, and we leave the rest of this pitiful town standing. Refuse, and we burn it all." "You're not taking my daughter." Mr. Mitchell stepped forward, shotgun in hand. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats before Nora's voice broke the silence. "If I go with you," she said, stepping around Thomas despite his attempt to hold her back, "you'll leave my father and the town alone." "Nora, no," Thomas whispered fiercely. Reeves smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "You have my word as a gentleman." "The word of an outlaw isn't worth the air it takes to speak it," Thomas said. "Nevertheless," Nora replied quietly, "if there's a chance to save lives, I must take it." She turned to Thomas, her expression resolute despite the fear in her eyes. "You taught me that sometimes protection means sacrifice." Before Thomas could respond, gunfire erupted from the far end of the street. 2 riders were approaching at a gallop, firing as they came. "Marshal's men," someone shouted from a nearby building. Chaos descended as Reeves and his men returned fire. Thomas seized the opportunity, pulling Nora and her father toward the shelter of the store. A bullet splintered the doorframe as they ducked inside. The gunfight outside intensified. Through the window, Thomas saw one of Reeves's men fall. The outlaws were retreating, firing as they mounted their horses. "This isn't over," Reeves shouted as he galloped away. "I'll be back for what's mine." When the shooting stopped, Thomas cautiously ventured outside. The 2 riders who had interrupted the confrontation were dismounting, neither wearing a marshal's badge. "Bounty hunters," the taller of the 2 explained when Thomas questioned them. "Been tracking Reeves for months, figured we'd find him here." "He'll be back," Thomas said, watching the distant dust cloud of the retreating outlaws. "Count on it," the bounty hunter agreed. "Man's obsessed with collecting things that catch his eye. Word is he's got a camp in the hills to the north, won't go far." The news confirmed Thomas's fears. That night, after ensuring the bounty hunters would remain in town, he sat with Nora and her father to discuss their options. "Fort Laramie is still our best choice," Thomas insisted. "And abandon everyone here," Nora challenged. "Reeves threatened the whole town." "The bounty hunters will stay a few days," Thomas countered, "but eventually they'll move on. Reeves is patient, he'll wait." "Then we need a more permanent solution," Nora said, her expression hardening with determination. "Reeves needs to be brought to justice." Thomas saw the dangerous resolve forming in her eyes. "Nora, don't even think about it. These men are killers." "I'm not suggesting confronting them directly," she replied. "But the bounty hunters mentioned his camp. If someone could find it, bring the marshal." "Absolutely not," her father interjected. "No one is going looking for that monster's hideout." The argument continued until exhaustion forced them all to rest, though Thomas suspected none of them slept soundly. The next morning brought an unexpected development. A letter arrived for Nora, delivered by a nervous-looking boy who refused to say who had given it to him. Thomas watched her face pale as she read the single page. "What is it?" he asked, dreading the answer. "It's from Reeves," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "He says he's claiming me, says I'm to be his bride, to ride with him and his men." Thomas took the letter, rage building as he scanned the flowery yet menacing prose. Reeves wrote as if proposing a courtship, describing how he'd first noticed Nora months earlier when passing through town. He'd been watching, planning. The letter ended with a chilling promise. He would come for her when she least expected it, and any who interfered would die. "This ends now," Thomas said, crumpling the paper. "I'm going to find his camp." "Thomas, you can't," Nora gripped his arm. "He has at least 6 men with him." "I won't go alone," the plan was forming in his mind. "The bounty hunters know these hills. With their help and a few volunteers from town, we can bring enough men to overwhelm them." Mr. Mitchell looked skeptical. Townspeople against hardened outlaws, it would be a massacre. "Not if we have the element of surprise," Thomas argued, "and not if we get the marshal involved." "The nearest marshal is 2 days' ride," Nora reminded him. "Then I'll ride to get him after we locate the camp. The bounty hunters and volunteers can keep watch until we return with the law." The plan was risky, filled with potential for disaster, but the alternative seemed worse. By midday, Thomas had recruited the bounty hunters and 3 other men willing to search for Reeves's hideout. "Be careful," Nora said as she helped him prepare his saddlebags. "Reeves is cunning. He wouldn't send that letter without having some plan." Thomas paused in his preparations, turning to face her. "I'll return," he promised. "And when this is over," he stopped, uncertain how to express feelings he was only beginning to understand himself. Nora stepped closer. "When this is over." "When this is over, I'd like to court you properly," he said, the words coming more easily than he had expected. "If you'll allow it." Her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I would like that very much, Thomas Griffin." The moment hung between them, fragile and precious, before reality intruded. It was time to go. The search party rode out that afternoon, heading into the foothills north of town, where abandoned mining camps offered natural hiding places. They split into pairs to cover more ground, agreeing to regroup at sundown. Thomas and one of the bounty hunters, a weathered man called Simmons, took the eastern approach. For hours they saw nothing but wildlife and the occasional prospector's abandoned claim. As the sun began its descent, they crested a ridge overlooking a secluded valley. Smoke rose from among the trees below. "That's no campfire," Simmons murmured, handing Thomas a spyglass. Through the lens, Thomas could make out several structures, old mining buildings repurposed into a hidden stronghold. Men moved between the buildings, and horses were corralled nearby. "That's it," he said, counting at least 8 figures. "Reeves's hideout." They watched until dusk, noting the patterns of movement, before retreating to meet the others. By the time they regrouped, another pair had found signs of outlaw presence in a different location. 2 camps, Simmons concluded. "Reeves is splitting his forces. Smart, makes him harder to track." Thomas felt unease growing, or he's preparing for something. The bounty hunters agreed to maintain watch on both locations, while Thomas rode for the marshal. He would leave at first light, hoping to return within 4 days. He returned to Silverpine after dark, exhausted but determined. After reporting their findings to Mr. Mitchell, he sought out Nora, finding her organizing supplies in the store's back room. "You found them," she said, reading the answer in his expression. "Yes, I'll leave for the marshal at dawn." She nodded, her movements stilling. "I had a visitor while you were gone, Mrs. Henderson from the farm south of town. She said riders have been watching their property, described one with a scar exactly like Reeves's." Thomas frowned. "They're scouting the area. Probably looking for escape routes. Or preparing to make good on their threats against the town," Nora suggested. The possibility had occurred to Thomas as well. All the more reason to bring the marshal quickly. They spoke late into the night, discussing preparations to defend the town if necessary. When Thomas finally left to get what sleep he could before his journey, Nora walked him to the door. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I promise," he hesitated, then added, "and you stay close to your father and the bounty hunters, don't take any risks." "I won't," she assured him, then rose on her tiptoes to press a soft kiss to his cheek. "For luck," she explained, color rising in her face. Thomas left feeling both lighter and heavier, lighter from her kiss, heavier from the responsibility he carried. Sleep eluded him as he prepared for the long ride ahead. The next morning arrived with a thin mist clinging to the streets of Silverpine. Thomas saddled his horse before sunrise, intending to make as many miles as possible before the day's heat slowed his progress. He He was checking his saddlebags one final time when rapid hoofbeats approached. One of the townsmen who had joined the search party the previous day galloped up, his face tight with urgency. "They're gone," the man exclaimed, reining in his horse. "Who's gone?" Thomas demanded. "Reeves and his men, both camps are deserted. Simmons sent me to warn you. They rode out sometime in the night." Cold dread washed over Thomas. "Did they head this way?" "Don't know. Simmons is trying to track them, but they split up." "Could be anywhere." Thomas swung onto his horse. "Get the town prepared, barricade the main buildings. I'm going to check on the Mitchells." He spurred his horse toward the general store, praying he wasn't too late. The streets were still mostly empty, the town just beginning to stir. When he reached the store, he was relieved to find the doors still locked, no signs of disturbance. Mr. Mitchell answered his insistent knocking, shotgun in hand. "Reeves and his men have moved," Thomas explained quickly. "Is Nora here?" The blood drained from the older man's face. "She left at dawn to take medicine to the Henderson farm. Their boy's been sick." "She said you knew." "I knew they needed medicine, but she promised to stay in town," Thomas said, already turning back to his horse. "How long ago?" "About an hour she took the wagon." Thomas calculated quickly. The Henderson farm was 5 miles south. If Nora had left an hour ago, she would be nearly there by now, or already walking into a trap. "Get the bounty hunters and anyone with a gun," he told Mr. Mitchell. "Send them to the Henderson place. I'm going ahead." Without waiting for a response, he galloped south out of town, pushing his horse to its limits. The morning mist had begun to burn away, affording him better visibility as he followed the rutted track leading to the outlying farms. He was halfway to the Hendersons when he saw the wagon, abandoned at the side of the road. Thomas dismounted, heart pounding as he examined the scene. There had been a struggle, the dirt was scuffed with footprints, and a basket of supplies lay overturned nearby. A piece of paper had been nailed to the wagon seat. Thomas tore it free, reading the bold scrawl with mounting fury. "The lady has agreed to be my bride. Any attempt to interfere will result in her death." Jr. The audacity of the lie that Nora had agreed to anything fueled Thomas's rage. Nearby hoofprints told the story Reeves had tried to conceal. At least 3 horses heading east toward the mountains. Thomas knew he should wait for reinforcements. Reeves had more men, more guns, but every minute that passed was another minute Nora spent in the hands of a killer. He remounted and followed the tracks, keeping to the tree line when possible to avoid being spotted. The trail led into increasingly rugged terrain, eventually joining a faint path that wound upward into the hills. After an hour of careful tracking, Thomas caught his first glimpse of the outlaws. 3 riders moving at a steady pace, with Nora bound and seated in front of Reeves on his horse. They were still too far for Thomas to attempt a rescue alone, especially in open country where he would be spotted immediately. He maintained his distance, waiting for terrain that would offer better cover. As they approached a narrow canyon, Thomas recognized his opportunity. The path ahead forced the riders to proceed in single file between high rock walls, the perfect place for an ambush. Urging his horse forward along a parallel ridge, Thomas dismounted when he reached a position overlooking the canyon. He removed his rifle from its scabbard and checked that it was loaded, then settled into position among the rocks. The outlaws entered the canyon, Reeves in the lead with Nora. Thomas lined up his shot carefully on the last rider, knowing he would only get one chance before they spotted his position. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed through the canyon as the last rider tumbled from his saddle. Before the others could react, Thomas fired again, striking the second man in the shoulder. Chaos erupted below. Reeves dragged Nora from his horse, using her as a shield as he sought cover behind a boulder. The wounded outlaw fired wildly in Thomas's direction, bullets ricocheting off the rocks around him. "I know it's you, Cowboy," Reeves shouted up toward Thomas's position. "You're only making this harder on the lady." Thomas shifted position, moving carefully to avoid dislodging rocks that would give away his exact location. "Let her go, Reeves," he called back. "The bounty hunters know where your camps are. The marshal's on his way. It's over." Reeves laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the confined space. "Nothing's over till I say it is. And I say the lady leaves with me, or she doesn't leave at all." Thomas caught a glimpse of Nora, her blonde hair unmistakable even at this distance. Her hands were bound, but her posture remained defiant. She was watching, calculating, waiting for her chance. The wounded outlaw attempted to reach his fallen comrade's horse, exposing himself momentarily. Thomas fired and the man collapsed. "Just you and me now, Reeves," Thomas called. "Let Nora go and you might still ride away." "You're not in a position to negotiate," Reeves shouted back, pressing his pistol against Nora's temple. "Show yourself or I put a bullet in her right now." Thomas knew it was no idle threat. He had to change the dynamics of this standoff. "If you shoot her, you're dead the next second," he responded, "but I'm willing to talk face to face." There was a pause as Reeves considered. "Throw down your rifle where I can see it, then come down, slow." Thomas hesitated, knowing he was potentially walking into his own execution, but a glance at Nora steeled his resolve. If there was even a chance of saving her, he had to take it. He tossed his rifle over the edge where it clattered visibly on the canyon floor. Then he began making his way down, keeping his hands visible. "That's it, Cowboy," Reeves called. "Nice and easy." As Thomas reached the canyon floor, he could see Nora more clearly. There was a bruise forming on her cheek, and fury blazed in her eyes, not fear but anger. She met his gaze steadily, giving an almost imperceptible nod. "Let her go, Reeves," Thomas said, stopping 20 feet away. "This is between you and me." Reeves smirked, keeping his gun pressed to Nora's head. "You know, I've been watching her for months, waiting for the right moment. She's special, got fire in her, not like other women who break too easily." "You don't know the first thing about her," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "I know she deserves better than a saddle tramp with no prospects," Reeves taunted. "What can you offer her? A life of poverty. With me, she'll have adventure, excitement." "She'll have a life on the run with a murderer," Thomas countered, taking a small step forward. "If you truly cared for her, you'd let her choose." Something dangerous flickered in Reeves's eyes. "You think she'd choose you?" "I know she wouldn't choose to be dragged away at gunpoint." Reeves's grip on Nora tightened. "Enough talk. Here's what happens next. You're going to turn around and walk away. When I can't see you anymore, maybe I'll treat the lady with the respect she deserves." Thomas shook his head. "I'm not leaving without her." "Then you're dying here." Reeves shifted his aim toward Thomas. In that moment, Nora acted. She drove her elbow hard into Reeves's ribs, throwing off his aim as he fired. The bullet grazed Thomas's arm as he lunged forward. The two men collided with bone-jarring force. Thomas's momentum carried them both to the ground, the gun spinning from Reeves's grasp. They grappled in the dust, each fighting for dominant position. Reeves was stronger than his lean frame suggested, landing a powerful blow to Thomas's jaw that sent stars exploding across his vision. Thomas responded with a strike to Reeves's throat that had the outlaw gasping for air. From the corner of his eye, Thomas saw Nora working to free herself, using a sharp rock to saw at her bindings. Reeves noticed too. With a roar of anger, he reached for a knife at his belt. Thomas caught his wrist, the blade hovering inches from his face as they strained against each other. "She was supposed to be mine," Reeves snarled, his face contorted with rage. "She doesn't belong to anyone," Thomas gritted out, feeling his strength beginning to fade. The knife edged closer to his throat. Thomas could feel the cold metal just touching his skin when a gunshot cracked through the air. Reeves's eyes widened in surprise. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, then over at Nora, who stood with his fallen pistol gripped in her bound hands. "You're right," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "I don't belong to anyone." Reeves collapsed, the knife falling harmlessly aside. Thomas scrambled away from the dying outlaw, moving to Nora's side. "Are you hurt?" he asked, gently taking the gun from her trembling hands. "No," she whispered, though the bruise on her cheek suggested otherwise. "You came for me." "I'll always come for you," Thomas promised, using his own knife to cut through her remaining bindings. As he freed her hands, the sound of approaching riders echoed through the canyon. Thomas tensed, reaching for the pistol again, but relaxed when he recognized Simmons and the other bounty hunter, followed by several men from town, including Mr. Mitchell. "Nora," her father cried, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. Father and daughter embraced as Thomas explained what had happened. The bounty hunters examined Reeves's body with professional detachment. $2,000 reward, Simmons noted, dead or alive. "You should claim it," Thomas told him. "We wouldn't have found their hideout without you." Simmons shook his head. Seems to me the lady did the hard part, he gestured to Nora. The reward's hers by right. The ride back to Silverpine was slow, with Nora sharing Thomas's horse while her father and the others dealt with the outlaw's bodies. As they traveled, she told him of how Reeves had ambushed her on the road, claiming he'd been watching her for months. He said I was the only woman worthy of riding with him, she said with disgust. That he'd chosen me to be his bride, to help him build some kind of outlaw empire. Thomas tightened his arms around her. I'm sorry I wasn't there to prevent it. Nora twisted in the saddle to look at him. You came after me alone against 3 armed men. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever witnessed. Probably both, Thomas admitted with a faint smile. When they reached town, news of Reeves's death spread quickly. The citizens of Silverpine emerged from their barricaded buildings to celebrate the end of the outlaw threat. The remaining members of Reeves's gang, learning of their leader's fate, fled the territory. The bounty hunters insisted on splitting the reward money with Nora despite her protests. Consider it a wedding present, Simmons told her with a wink in Thomas's direction. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself at a crossroads. With Reeves gone, his agreement to protect the Mitchells had technically concluded. The cattle drives would continue without him, other ranches would need hands. The life of a solitary cowboy, the only life he had known, beckoned. Yet when he looked at Nora, he knew that life no longer held appeal. 1 week after the confrontation in the canyon, Thomas found Nora alone in the store, inventorying a new shipment of goods. I've been thinking, he began awkwardly. She looked up, a smile softening her features. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish shadow. That sounds dangerous. Your father mentioned you want to start a school someday, he continued. The reward money would probably be enough for a building. Nora nodded slowly. It would, though I'd need somewhere to live as well. Thomas took a deep breath. I've been saving for land of my own. Not much, but with some hard work it could become a decent ranch. It's about 3 miles outside of town. Close enough for a teacher to commute, Nora observed, her eyes never leaving his. Exactly what I was thinking. He moved closer, taking her hands in his. Nora, I know this isn't the most romantic way to ask, but would you consider, that is, would you do me the honor? Yes, she interrupted, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Griffin. Relief and joy surged through him. I haven't even finished asking properly. You don't need to, she laughed, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. I've known my answer since you came back for me. They were married that autumn, after Thomas had built a small but sturdy house on his land. The ceremony was held in the newly constructed schoolhouse that bore Nora's name on the sign above the door. As winter settled over the Montana territory, bringing with it bitter cold and deep snows, Thomas often found himself marveling at how completely his beliefs had been transformed. The solitude he had once thought necessary now seemed hollow compared to the warmth of sharing his life with Nora. On a particularly cold evening, as they sat before the fire in their home, Nora reading aloud from one of her precious books, Thomas realized a fundamental truth. The frontier wasn't a place that precluded love, as his father had claimed. Rather, it was a place where love was most essential, the foundation that made the hardship bearable, the isolation conquerable. What are you thinking? Nora asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. That I was wrong, he replied simply. All those years I believed a cowboy's life had to be solitary. That connection was impossible in a place like this. She smiled, setting aside her book to move closer to him. And now? Thomas pulled her into his embrace, feeling the steady beating of her heart against his own. Now I know better. This life, our life, is richer than anything I could have imagined alone. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside their home, Thomas and Nora had found a warmth that no winter could touch, the enduring heat of a love born in danger, tested by trial and ultimately triumphant over the wild frontier that had once seemed so unforgiving.